Have you ever wondered what was the first controversial game ever made? Some people would point you to Custer's Revenge for the Atari 2600, but in reality the earliest game was none other than Exidy's second venture into driving games, called Death Race. Released 6 years before Custer's Revenge in 1976, Death Race was launched. It reached arcade owners in various parts of the country, and what began as a simple game that wasn't doing too good in sales turned out to be one of the very first games to cause somewhat of an outrage. Interested in the story? Sit back, relax, and let me, your captain, tell you the story about it. Let us explain what Death Race is. It's technically a reskin or a modified version of Destruction Derby, and Destruction Derby was Exidy's first driving game. Exidy sold the rights or the license of Destruction Derby to another gaming company. What ended up happening was that the company dissolved due to financial hardship, and now Exidy couldn't profit from Destruction Derby. So they decided that the most sensible thing was to grab Destruction Derby, make modifications to its code, and then create Death Race. The arcade cabinet has wheels and a gear shift, and I think it also has the pedals. So basically you drive the car around with that. Your objective is to run over as many gremlins as possible and gain many points by doing so. Yes, those things you're seeing on the screen are gremlins. They look like humans, and we're gonna get into that. But basically when you run them over, they scream and something like a tombstone appears over their bodies. And that is the game. And that is the controversy. That is the entire controversy. What you're seeing on the screen is actually the game in the arcade version. Don't confuse it for the NES unlicensed version, which is a lot more elaborate. That version of the game has the the gremlins attacking you, which makes the violence seem a little more justifiable. There's designs of the car, there's modifications to the cars that you can make, but the game is, as I said, unlicensed, and it has nothing to do with the original controversy. So let's get back into that. Let's be frank here, the thinly veiled attempt to make these humanoid-looking pedestrians into quote-unquote gremlins is not lost on us. The working title of the game when they were developing it was called Pedestrians, which alludes that they eventually had to change things to placate a coming outrage. They knew this was gonna happen. And they didn't do it so successfully either. Prior to the controversy, as I mentioned before, Exidy had only sold like 200 copies of this arcade cabinet. It wasn't doing very successfully, but apparently the whole thing started when someone mistook the shrieks from the gremlins when you run them over as children's cry. That's where the outrage started to begin. And I love that in my notes I am desperately attempting to make a mention of this one public advisor, I think it was for vehicular safety, that says, "Death Race teaches you the morbid skill of running people over." My brother in Christ, that is not a skill. That is the opposite of a skill. Let us remember that by this time there was the arcade addictions concern, which meant that there was a little bit of a spotlight for games, but it wasn't such a pressure like with games like Night Trap and Mortal Kombat, or even Chiller that came out way later. But it didn't help that Death Race was kind of pushing a boundary when this discussion was already happening. So because of this, a lot of articles and a lot of comments came out in regards to Exidy's Death Race, which, of course, by nature of controversial things, Exidy sold more cabinets that they've ever had. And it's interesting because it's very unlike its successor, Chiller, which is a topic for another video. But to make it very brief, when Chiller came out, it was kind of way more controversial than this, and of course it was 10 years later. So the cabinets didn't sell at all, people weren't even venturing to buy it. Exidy sold so many more cabinets that they ran out and they had a backlog of orders to fill. The company was doing great. But of course, by the end of 1977, the game no longer graced headlines, and ergo, started to dwindle in history. Nobody was paying attention to the game, it was getting old, and frankly, the game isn't that entertaining after quite some time. Unlike Night Trap, Mortal Kombat, and all the other transgressive games that we know now, this game did not spur major action against the video games. It caused an outrage, it caused a panic, but it didn't get so far because even by then, it was kind of a stupid thing to worry about. Again, the discussion of video games and violence was very new, very recent. People were starting to do research papers about it. Just starting. Nothing was ever concrete or set in stone. The arcade edition was a concern, Death Race or not. It didn't matter if Death Race phased out, the concerns were there. They would just pick somebody else to be concerned about. And thus, Death Race faded into obscurity. Nowadays, Death Race is more or less a cult classic. It's only known by those who are very, very interested in arcade or very interested in the earlier controversial games and horror games, because technically Death Race is a horror game. One of the earliest examples of a horror game, I would even dare to say. It didn't make a huge mark like Night Trap, but it made a mark just enough for Exidy to be remembered. Controversy can exist when there's 5 pixels on the screen. Death Race was proof of that. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to support this channel and if you really want to support the performance of this video, you can leave a like, you can subscribe, and hell, shoot me a comment. Tell me about this game. Have you ever played it? Have you ever seen it? All of you who are old enough to have been to the arcades back then, do you remember any other games from Exidy? And if you saw Death Race somewhere, did you play it? Did somebody explain the story to you? Tell us all about it as well. Once again, thank you very much for watching. Please stay safe out there. I'll see you guys later. The captain is out.